My dad emptied my entire $180,000 college fund to pay for my golden sister's extravagant wedding, thinking he controlled my future. He looked me right in the eye and told me to take out student loans because her perfect day mattered more than my education. He never expected that I didn't actually need his money. He had no idea that I had already built a tech empire in secret and was sitting on over $3 million. On the day of that wedding, I decided to give him exactly what he asked for. If you want to understand how a family gets to the point where a father can steal his youngest daughter's future to buy flowers for his oldest, you have to understand the foundation my family was built on. My name is Stella. I am 22 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been a ghost in my own home. I grew up in a sprawling, beautiful house in Bellevue, Washington. It was the kind of neighborhood where lawns were manicured by professionals every Tuesday, where the driveways were paved with pristine cobblestone, and where appearances were the absolute most important currency a person could possess. Our house had massive windows, vaulted ceilings, and a grand staircase that looked like it belonged in a movie. But if you walked through that house, if you really paid attention to the details on the walls and the shelves, you would notice something incredibly strange and deeply unsettling. Almost every single photograph, every framed portrait, every candid snapshot stuck to the refrigerator was of Mackenzie. Mackenzie is my older sister. She is 26, and from the exact moment she was born, she was the undisputed, gravity-defying center of my parents' universe. Victor and Brenda, my parents, didn't just love Mackenzie. They worshipped at the altar of her existence. She was loud, she was fiercely demanding, and she required a constant, exhausting amount of attention to function. She was a cheerleader, a pageant contestant, the lead in the school play, and the girl who always needed an audience. I learned very early on that the easiest way to survive in that suffocating environment was to take up as little physical and emotional space as possible. If Mackenzie was the sun, blinding and impossible to ignore, demanding that all planets orbit around her, I was the dark, quiet corner of the room that nobody ever bothered to look at. I remember my 18th birthday vividly. It is a memory that perfectly encapsulates our completely fractured family dynamic, a memory that still tastes like ash in my mouth. Mackenzie had turned 18 4 years prior, and on her birthday, my parents threw a massive, catered party. They rented a tent for the backyard, hired a local DJ, and invited half the town. At the climax of the night, they blindfolded her, walked her out to the driveway, and surprised her with a brand-new, silver convertible with a giant red bow on the hood. There were balloons, hysterical tears of joy, and a professional photographer hired specifically to capture the magical moment. When my 18th birthday rolled around, I didn't expect a car. I wasn't delusional. I knew my place in the hierarchy. But I did expect something. A dinner out, maybe a small cake, perhaps a genuine smile. Instead, Victor handed me a poorly wrapped cardboard box right after a silent, tense family dinner. Inside was a heavy, gray winter coat. It still had a faint, musty smell of mothballs. It was a used coat Brenda had bought from a local thrift store because, as she put it while sipping her wine, I was going to college in a colder climate and needed to be practical, and there was no sense in spending good money on something I would just ruin anyway. Later that exact same week, Victor gave Mackenzie $2,000 in cash, no questions asked, just because she wanted to go on a spontaneous weekend trip with her friends to Los Angeles to go shopping. That was the unbreakable baseline of my existence. Mackenzie got brand new cars, European vacations, endless grace for every mistake she made, and a permanent safety net woven from my parents' bank accounts. I got hand-me-downs, polite nods, and the unspoken, heavy expectation that I would take care of myself so they could focus all their energy on her. I used to cry about it when I was much younger. I used to try to get straight A's on every test, win regional science fairs, do absolutely anything to make them look at me the way they looked at her. But by the time I was a teenager, staring at the back of their heads while they watched Mackenzie's dance recitals, I realized something fundamental and tragic. You cannot negotiate desire. You cannot force someone to care. They simply didn't want to be my parents the way they wanted to be hers. So, I stopped trying. I stopped asking for new clothes. I stopped complaining about being left behind. I became incredibly self-reliant, which ironically only made it easier for them to ignore me. I built a thick, impenetrable wall around my emotions. I smiled when I was supposed to smile, I stayed quietly out of their way, and I meticulously prepared for the day I could leave that house and never look back. I thought I had made peace with being the invisible daughter. I didn't realize that my independence wasn't a relief to them, it was just a convenient excuse for them to exploit me later when they needed something to sacrifice. The only person in our entire extended family who ever saw through the blinding, artificial light of Mackenzie was my grandmother. She was my father's mother, a tough, pragmatic woman who didn't buy into the pageant queen nonsense my parents fostered. Before she passed away when I was 10 years old, she did something that she genuinely thought would guarantee my safety and my future. She left a substantial inheritance specifically and legally designated for our higher education. The total amount was $360,000, and her will explicitly stated it was to be split exactly down the middle. $180,000 for Mackenzie's future and $180,000 for mine. Because I was a minor at the time of her passing, my grandmother's will stipulated that the money be placed in a joint savings account. Legally, the account was in my name, and the funds were tied to my social security number, but Victor was listed as the primary custodian and joint account holder. This meant that legally speaking, he had full, unrestricted access to the funds and could authorize withdrawals or transfers without ever needing my signature or my permission. My grandmother trusted him to do the right thing. She assumed, as any rational person would, that a father would protect his daughter's future with his life. She believed that tying the money to education would force his hand to be fair. It was a beautiful, heartbreakingly naive assumption. The difference in how Mackenzie and I treated our inheritance was astronomical, highlighting exactly who we were as people. When Mackenzie went to college, she treated her $180,000 like an unlimited, magical luxury budget that would somehow replenish itself. She absolutely refused to live in standard dorms, insisting on leasing the most expensive, off-campus luxury apartments that featured rooftop pools and private gyms. She changed her major 4 different times, bouncing recklessly from pre-med, because she liked the idea of being a doctor, to art history, to communications, adding 2 full years to her undergraduate degree. She used the educational funds to finance extravagant spring break trips to Cancun, Miami, and even a 3-week backpacking trip across Europe, claiming she desperately needed to decompress from the immense stress of studying. Victor and Brenda never once stopped her. They never told her no. By the time she finally managed to graduate, at 24 years old, her account was completely and utterly empty. In fact, it was worse than empty. Victor had quietly paid off an additional $20,000 in high-interest credit card debt she had racked up on clothes and expensive dinners, just so his precious golden child wouldn't have to start her adult life in the red. I, on the other hand, treated my account like a sacred, fragile artifact. I knew it was my only guaranteed ticket out of that house and away from their conditional love. I didn't want to owe Victor and Brenda a single dime, because I knew their money always came with invisible strings attached. When I went to college, I chose a solid, highly ranked, but reasonably priced state university over 3 hours away. I lived in the absolute cheapest, dingiest dorms I could find, sharing a bathroom with 30 other girls. I worked part-time at the campus library, shelving books for minimum wage just to pay for my own groceries, my phone bill, and my textbooks, leaving the inheritance entirely untouched except for the exact, calculated cost of tuition and basic housing each semester. Entering my senior year, I had managed my finances so meticulously, denying myself spring breaks and new clothes, that my balance still sat at a very healthy $180,000. I planned to use a small portion of the remaining funds to cover my final year, and then use the rest as a down payment on a small, modest house to jumpstart my independent life. Every single time I logged into the online banking portal, seeing that exact number gave me a profound, physical sense of peace. It was tangible proof that I existed. It was proof that my grandmother loved me enough to protect me, and it was a solid, undeniable guarantee that I would never, ever have to depend on Victor or Brenda for anything. I never checked the account obsessively. I usually only logged in once at the start of every semester when it was time to authorize the transfer to the university. I trusted the banking system. More dangerously, I trusted that even though Victor was legally on the account, he would never actually cross the ultimate moral line of stealing from his own flesh and blood. I knew he favored Mackenzie, I knew he would always choose her over me, but I honestly believed that outright stealing his youngest daughter's education fund was a bridge too far, a crime too ugly even for him. I was so incredibly wrong. The joint account, which was supposed to be my impenetrable armor, was actually just a loaded gun sitting patiently on the table, and Victor was just waiting for the right, desperate excuse to pull the trigger. While Mackenzie was busy planning her life around sorority parties and eventually, her ridiculously perfect wedding, I was living in a completely different, isolated reality. When I was 19, living in a cramped, incredibly noisy apartment in Seattle that permanently smelled faintly of old coffee and wet dog, I started coding in earnest. I had always been good with computers. It was a solitary, quiet activity that kept me locked in my room and out of my parents' way during my teenage years. But during my sophomore year of college, I started developing a highly specific piece of software. It was an artificial intelligence-based cybersecurity protocol designed specifically to detect zero-day vulnerabilities in massive cloud-based networks. I didn't have a normal college social life. I didn't go to frat parties, I didn't attend football games, and I barely had time to date. For 3 grueling years, my entire life consisted of waking up early, attending my computer science classes, working my mind-numbing shift at the library, and then coming home to sit in the dark and stare at glowing lines of code until my eyes blurred. My back ached, and the sun slowly came up over the Seattle skyline. I lived on cheap ramen noodles, tap water, and generic energy drinks bought in bulk. I was perpetually exhausted, chronically stressed, and completely socially isolated, but I was building something from scratch that was entirely, unequivocally mine. Nobody could take credit for it. Nobody could say they bought it for me. By the time I turned 21, the software protocol was fully functional and surprisingly robust. I started quietly and anonymously pitching it to various mid-level tech firms. I got a lot of rejections. People naturally didn't want to trust their enterprise security systems to a college kid working out of a messy bedroom. But I was relentless. Finally, a mid-sized but aggressive tech acquisition firm based in Silicon Valley took a video meeting with me. That single meeting led to a highly scrutinized beta test. The successful beta test led to months of agonizing negotiations, legal reviews, and formal offers. Just 3 months before Mackenzie's wedding date, sitting in my cheap, squeaky desk chair with a broken wheel, wearing a faded college sweatshirt, I signed a massive contract over a secure video call. I sold the intellectual property, the source code, and all rights to my software for $3.5 million after taxes. The money hit my personal, entirely private bank account exactly 1 week later. $3.5 million. I remember sitting on my stained, thrift store sofa, staring at the screen of my phone, holding my breath until my lungs burned. It was a number so incomprehensibly large that it didn't even feel real. It looked like a typo. But it wasn't. I had achieved absolute, undeniable financial freedom before I even received my bachelor's degree. But here is the most important part of the story. I didn't tell a single soul. I didn't post a celebratory picture on social media. I didn't call my parents. I didn't go out and buy a designer bag or a new luxury car. I woke up the next day, put on my cheap sneakers and oversized hoodie, and went to my library shift. Why? Because I knew, with absolute terrifying certainty, exactly what would happen if Victor and Brenda found out I had money. Mackenzie was currently in the middle of planning a wedding that was rapidly and violently spiraling out of control financially. She wanted a custom-fitted designer dress imported from Italy, an exotic floral arrangement that cost more than a car, and a historic venue that charged astronomical fees. If my parents knew I had over $3 million sitting comfortably in the bank, I would suddenly, miraculously become their favorite daughter. But not for me. I would become an endless, walking ATM. They would use every psychological trick in the book. They would gaslight, guilt-trip, cry, and manipulate me into funding Mackenzie's dream life. They would tell me that since I had been blessed with so much, it was my fundamental family duty to share the wealth. I knew that if I gave them a single inch, they would take every last penny to ensure Mackenzie never had to face reality. So, I built a silent, invisible empire. I hired a reputable wealth manager. I set up an ironclad trust fund that nobody but me could touch. I started quietly taking meetings with real estate agents, looking at luxury properties in downtown Seattle, meticulously planning my permanent escape. To my family, I was still just Stella, the quiet, slightly pathetic, perpetually struggling younger sister who was barely scraping by on a computer science degree. I let them keep their comfortable illusion. I was perfectly content to let them think I was nothing because I knew the undeniable truth. I didn't need their validation anymore. I was a self-made millionaire at 22. I thought I had perfectly insulated myself from their toxicity. I thought I could just quietly pay my final semester's tuition from my grandmother's fund, graduate, block their numbers, and disappear into my new, beautiful life. But I severely underestimated the sheer, bottomless entitlement of the golden child and the absolute, terrifying ruthlessness of a father desperate to please her at any cost. It was a completely ordinary Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks before Mackenzie's massive, impending wedding. The air outside my Seattle apartment was crisp, gray, and heavy with the familiar promise of endless rain. I woke up early, dragging myself out of bed with the usual exhaustion of a senior year student. I made myself a cup of cheap, bitter drip coffee out of pure, ingrained habit and sat down at my laptop. It was time to pay my tuition for my final, culminating semester. It was a mundane routine I had executed smoothly 6 times before. The process was simple. Log into the university's financial portal, check the exact balance due down to the cent, then log into the secure bank portal to transfer the precise funds from the joint savings account my grandmother had so lovingly left me. I typed in my username and my complex password for the bank's website. The little loading circles spun on the screen. I took a slow sip of my coffee, my eyes lazily scanning down the digital dashboard to the specific section labeled Joint Savings, Education. I froze. The hot coffee burned the tip of my tongue, but I didn't feel the pain. My brain simply stopped processing physical sensation. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, genuinely thinking the website was experiencing a glitch or that my early morning vision was blurry. I hit the refresh button on the browser. The page reloaded quickly. The numbers staring back at me stayed exactly the same. $0.00. My heart slammed against the inside of my ribs so violently that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The entire $180,000 was gone. Vanished. Wiped clean. I clicked frantically on the account details tab, my breathing turning shallow and ragged as I navigated to the transaction history. My hands were shaking so uncontrollably that I misclicked twice, accidentally opening a help menu before finally getting the actual ledger page to load. There, sitting glaringly at the very top of the list, was a single, massive transaction dated exactly 2 weeks prior. It was an outbound wire transfer for the exact, devastating amount of $180,000. The destination account was listed right next to it in bold black text. It was Victor's primary personal checking account. I sat there in the suffocating quiet of my small apartment, the low hum of the old refrigerator suddenly sounding as loud as a jet engine taking off. This wasn't a clerical bank error. This wasn't a sophisticated case of identity theft by some anonymous hacker halfway across the world. This was my father. My own flesh and blood. He had deliberately logged into the account, callously utilized his legal status as the joint custodian, and maliciously drained every single penny of the money my grandmother had left to guarantee my education. A cold, terrifying, paralyzing clarity washed over my entire body. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I moved like a programmed machine. I grabbed my car keys off the counter, threw a heavy waterproof jacket over my pajamas without bothering to change my clothes, and ran down the 3 flights of stairs to my 10-year-old, battered sedan. I drove the 45 minutes from Seattle to the wealthy suburbs of Bellevue in absolute, deafening silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't look at my phone. The highway blurred past me, a continuous streak of gray asphalt and wet pine trees. My knuckles were bone white as I gripped the steering wheel. My mind was racing, desperately trying to rationalize the impossible. Maybe it was a massive misunderstanding. Maybe his business was in sudden, catastrophic trouble, and he needed an emergency bridge loan for just a few days to avoid bankruptcy. Maybe his own account had been compromised and the bank had temporarily moved the funds for security reasons. I was pathetically, desperately trying to invent any logical scenario where my father hadn't just robbed me blind. But deep down, in the darkest, most honest pit of my stomach, I knew exactly where that money had gone. I knew what event was happening in exactly 4 weeks. I just needed to hear him say it out loud. I needed to stand in his pristine house, look him directly in the eyes, and see if he had even a single shred of shame left in his soul. I pulled into the wide, sweeping driveway of my parents' Bellevue house. Mackenzie's shiny, meticulously detailed SUV was parked right out front, gleaming even under the overcast sky. I walked up the perfectly paved cobblestone walkway, my heart feeling like a solid, heavy block of ice sitting in my chest. The massive wooden front door was slightly ajar, propped open by a decorative brick, likely left that way by one of the many wedding planners, florists, or caterers who had been constantly in and out of the house for the past several weeks. I didn't bother to knock. I pushed the door open and stepped silently into the grand foyer. The entire house smelled overwhelmingly of expensive vanilla candles, fresh lilies, and money. I could hear distinct voices echoing from the formal dining room down the long hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks, pressing my back flat against the cool drywall of the corridor. I wasn't consciously trying to hide, but my feet simply refused to move forward. My body was operating on pure survival instinct. I could hear Victor and Brenda talking. They weren't arguing. They weren't whispering in hushed, guilty tones. They were laughing. I still can't believe we actually managed to secure those imported crystal centerpieces, Brenda was saying, her voice thick with smug satisfaction and absolute delight. Mackenzie is going to completely lose her mind when she sees them on the tables. It completely elevates the entire aesthetic of the reception. It looks like a royal wedding. Well, when you have the cold hard cash ready to go and you don't have to finance it, vendors suddenly become very, very accommodating, Victor replied smoothly, his voice dripping with arrogant pride. I could hear the distinct clinking of ice against glass, probably him pouring his celebratory midday scotch. There was a brief, comfortable pause. Then, Brenda's voice dropped just a fraction lower, carrying a tiny, almost imperceptible hint of nervous hesitation. Victor, are you absolutely 100% sure about this? Stella's final tuition payment is due soon. What is she going to do when she logs in and realizes the account is completely empty? I held my breath. I closed my eyes so tightly that I saw stars, pressing my head hard against the wall. This was the moment. This was the exact moment my father would show a shred of humanity or remorse. He would say he planned to put it back tomorrow, that he felt terrible about borrowing it, that he was going to make it right and apologize to me. Victor scoffed. It was a short, sharp, violently dismissive sound that hit me physically, like a punch to the gut. Stella will figure it out, he said, his tone dripping with absolute, chilling indifference. She always does, doesn't she? She's resilient like a weed. She can just march down to the financial aid office and take out a student loan like normal, everyday kids do. She's smart, she'll get a decent job, and she'll pay it off eventually. It builds character. But Victor, it was her grandmother's money, Brenda weakly protested, though she didn't actually sound upset or morally conflicted. She just sounded mildly concerned about the potential family drama it might cause. It is family money, Brenda, Victor snapped back, his voice hardening into that authoritative tone he used to end arguments. And right now, this family needs it. Mackenzie only gets married once. She's fragile. She has anxiety. She needs everything to be absolutely picture perfect, or she'll have a complete emotional breakdown and ruin the day. Stella is perfectly used to surviving on her own. She doesn't need a free ride from my mother's estate. She needs to understand that when you are in a family, you make sacrifices for the greater good of each other. Standing frozen in that hallway, something deep inside my core fundamentally broke. But it wasn't a loud, dramatic, shattering break. It was a quiet, absolute, surgical severing. The very last, tiny, pathetic, desperate thread of hope I had that my parents actually harbored any genuine love for me simply snapped and dissolved into absolute nothingness. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had sat down, discussed it, and rationally justified stealing my future because it was more financially convenient for them, and because buying shiny crystal centerpieces for Mackenzie's vanity project was objectively more important to them than my entire college education and financial stability. The lingering grief of being the unloved daughter vanished entirely, replaced instantly by an absolute, freezing, terrifying numbness. The desperate girl who wanted their love died right there on the hardwood floor of the foyer. The person who remained was the cold, calculating architect of a $3 million tech empire, and she was absolutely not about to be their victim. I finally peeled myself off the wall, stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, and walked deliberately into the brightly lit dining room. Victor and Brenda were standing over the massive mahogany dining table, which was completely covered in expensive floral arrangements, silk fabric swatches, and glossy catering menus. They both physically jumped when they saw me standing in the doorway in my pajamas and rain jacket. "Stella!" Brenda gasped loudly, her hand flying dramatically to her chest as if I had startled her. "Good Lord, how long have you been standing there creeping around?" "Long enough," I said. My voice was eerily, unnaturally calm. It didn't sound like my voice at all. It sounded flat, hollow, and completely devoid of any human emotion. I didn't look at my mother. I looked directly into Victor's eyes. "Where is my $180,000, Victor?" I intentionally didn't call him Dad. I don't think he even registered the omission, or if he did, his ego simply ignored it. He immediately puffed up his chest, squaring his shoulders and adopting the aggressive, defensive, hyper-authoritative posture he always used when he knew he was completely in the wrong but adamantly refused to admit it. "Do not take that disrespectful tone with me inside my own house," Victor barked, pointing a thick finger at me. "The money you are referring to was in a joint account. My name was on it. Legally speaking, I had every single right to move those funds as the custodian." "I didn't ask for a pathetic legal justification," I said, keeping my facial expression completely blank and unyielding. "I asked where my tuition money went." Right on cue, Mackenzie strutted into the room from the kitchen, holding a thick, glossy wedding magazine and a cup of fancy herbal tea. She saw the intense standoff and immediately realized what was happening. Instead of looking even remotely guilty that her wedding was funded by stolen money, her perfectly made-up face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Oh my God, Stella, are you seriously doing this right now? I am literally so stressed out with the caterer messing up the vegetarian options, and you're coming in here throwing a massive tantrum over money." "Family comes first, Stella," Brenda chimed in, perfectly executing her practiced gaslighting routine, stepping closer to Victor to present a united front. "Your sister's wedding has unfortunately gone way over our initial budget. We needed liquid cash immediately to cover the vendors and secure the venue. You are young, you have your whole entire life ahead of you. You can easily take out a student loan to finish up. Why are you choosing to be so incredibly selfish and dramatic about this?" "Selfish." I repeated the word softly, letting it hang in the air. I looked at the three of them standing there. My father, standing tall and righteous after committing financial theft against his own child. My mother, nodding vigorously along, actively enabling the abuse. My sister, rolling her eyes and sighing because my stolen education was a minor inconvenience to her floral arrangement schedule. Victor stepped forward, closing the distance between us, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. He pointed that same finger directly at my face. "Listen to me very carefully, Stella. You will absolutely not ruin this month for your sister. You will drive yourself back to campus. You will go down to the financial aid office today. You will sign whatever loan papers they put in front of you, and you will show up to this wedding in 4 weeks with a smile on your face. Because I swear to God, if you cause a scene, or if you refuse to support your family on the most important day of her life, I will cut you off completely. You will have no family. I will disown you. Do you understand me? I looked at his pointing finger. I didn't flinch. Instead, my mind vividly conjured the image of the $3.5 million currently sitting safely in my highly encrypted, private trust account. I thought about the sleek, modern luxury penthouse overlooking the Seattle skyline that I was scheduled to close on in exactly 2 weeks. I thought about how much absolute power Victor genuinely believed he had over a girl who was already 10 times richer and infinitely smarter than he would ever be. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw a tantrum or break a glass. Instead, a slow, genuine, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. It was a polite, chilling, completely unbothered smile. Understood, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor blinked rapidly, clearly thrown completely off balance by my reaction. He had expected begging. He had prepared for tears, for screaming, for me to drop to my knees and plead for my future back. My calm, instant agreement deeply confused him. Good, he muttered, awkwardly adjusting his expensive collar and stepping back. I'm glad you're finally acting mature about this situation. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. I turned around, walked steadily out of the dining room, out the grand front door, and got back into my battered car. As I drove back through the rain to Seattle, the heavy weight that had sat on my chest for 22 years was completely gone. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt soaringly, intoxicatingly free. They had stolen my grandmother's money, but in doing so, they had handed me the absolute greatest gift possible, the ironclad, guilt-free permission to utterly and completely destroy them. If you are enjoying this story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you are watching from. Every comment helps the channel grow so we can bring you more amazing stories. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the story. The morning after the confrontation in my parents' dining room, the harassment began exactly as I had predicted. In families that operate like a cult worshipping a golden child, there is a very specific protocol when someone steps out of line. The parents don't just attack you directly, they dispatch their loyal soldiers, the flying monkeys, to terrorize you into submission. I woke up at 6 in the morning to my phone vibrating so violently against my cheap nightstand that it almost fell off. I rolled over, picked it up, and saw dozens of notifications lighting up the cracked screen. The first attack came from my Aunt Pamela, Victor's older sister. Pamela was a woman who had never worked a day in her life, lived off her husband's money, and spent her free time judging everyone else's moral compass. Her text message was a massive, single paragraph of pure, unadulterated guilt-tripping. She wrote that she was absolutely disgusted to hear that I was causing my mother such severe emotional distress so close to the wedding. She told me that I belonged to a selfish, entitled generation that didn't understand the sacred meaning of family sacrifice. She ended the novel of a text message by saying that my grandmother would be spinning in her grave if she knew I was being so incredibly stingy and petty over money when my sister's happiness was on the line. I read the message twice. A day earlier, those words would have stung. They would have made me question my own sanity and wonder if I really was the villain of the story. But now, looking at the glowing text, I felt nothing but a clinical, detached fascination. It was like reading a case study in a psychology textbook. I took a screenshot and saved it to a secure folder I had named The Exit. Next was a voicemail from my older cousin, Derek. Derek was a failed real estate agent who still lived in his parents' basement, but loved to give everyone else unsolicited life advice. I hit play and listened to his condescending sigh fill my quiet apartment. He told me that I needed to grow up, stop throwing a temper tantrum, and pay my dues. He actually had the audacity to say that Mackenzie deserved a perfect day because she had worked so hard, completely ignoring the fact that her wedding was currently being financed by my stolen tuition money. He told me to swallow my pride, go apologize to Victor, and be a good little bridesmaid. I saved the voicemail to the same folder. Then came the family group chat. It was titled Mackenzie's Dream Wedding and had about 20 different relatives in it. The chat was an absolute war zone of passive-aggressive tagging. Mackenzie was leading the charge, sending crying emojis and talking about how her energy was completely ruined by toxic family members. Other relatives were chiming in, demanding to know why I wasn't answering my phone, telling me I needed to step up and pay for my own bridesmaid dress and hairstyling because Victor and Brenda were already stretched so thin. They were publicly crucifying me in a digital town square, demanding that I hand over even more money to the people who had just robbed me. I didn't turn off my phone. I didn't throw it against the wall. Instead, I methodically went through my settings. I muted the group chat so it wouldn't buzz, but I left it active so I could collect every single piece of evidence. I restricted the phone numbers of Pamela, Derek, and a dozen other relatives. They could shout into the void all they wanted, but they couldn't disrupt my peace. I was treating them the way a cybersecurity engineer treats a malware attack. You isolate the threat, you observe its behavior, you document the data, and then, when the time is right, you completely neutralize the system. They thought they were breaking me down. They had no idea they were just handing me the ammunition I needed for the final strike. While my family spent the next 2 weeks obsessing over napkin colors, floral arches, and tearing down my character in their group chat, I was focused on an entirely different kind of transition. I took a few days off from my classes and scheduled a private meeting with my newly appointed wealth manager at a sleek, high-security financial firm in downtown Seattle. Walking into that glass-walled office wearing my usual faded jeans and a plain sweater, I looked like a lost college student who had wandered into the wrong building. But the moment I sat down at the mahogany conference table, the dynamic shifted. We spent 4 hours meticulously organizing my assets. I directed them to set up an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I made absolutely certain that the legal structure was designed so that no one, especially not Victor or Brenda, could ever contest it, claim guardianship, or access a single cent of the $3.5 million, even in the event of a catastrophic medical emergency. I was legally severing any potential financial ties my family could ever try to exploit. Once the fortress around my money was secure, it was time to upgrade my physical reality. I contacted a high-end real estate broker who specialized in luxury downtown properties. I didn't want to rent anymore. I wanted a permanent fortress. Within 3 days, I found it. It was a stunning, modern penthouse located on the 32nd floor of a newly constructed high-rise overlooking the Puget Sound. It had floor-to-ceiling windows, smart home security systems, private elevator access, and a kitchen that looked like a magazine cover. The asking price was $1.2 million. I didn't negotiate. I didn't apply for a mortgage. I instructed my wealth manager to wire the funds and bought the property entirely in cash. The contrast between my two worlds during those final weeks was almost comical. On one side, my phone would silently accumulate notifications from the family group chat, featuring Mackenzie having an absolute meltdown because the caterer wanted to charge an extra $500 for a specific type of imported cheese, and Brenda begging the relatives to chip in. On the other side, I was quietly packing my few belongings into cardboard boxes, throwing away my thrift store furniture, and watching professional movers carefully transport my clothes into $1 million penthouse that I owned free and clear. The day I officially moved in, I stood in the middle of the massive, empty living room, looking out at the glittering Seattle skyline as the sun set over the water. The silence in the apartment was profound. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of my childhood home, where I had to hide to survive. It was the rich, expansive silence of total freedom. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked out onto the private balcony, and let the cold wind hit my face. Victor had stolen my grandmother's gift, thinking he was trapping me in a cycle of debt and dependence. He thought taking $180,000 would break my spirit. He had no idea that I had just dropped over $1 million on a piece of real estate without even checking my budget. I was safe. I was untouchable. The fortress was complete. Now, all I had to do was wait for the wedding day to arrive and let them destroy their own illusions. It was Wednesday, exactly 3 days before the Saturday wedding. I was sitting at the massive quartz island in my new penthouse kitchen, casually reviewing a portfolio of angel investment opportunities my wealth manager had sent over. My phone, sitting on the counter, began to vibrate. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID flashed Victor's name. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I knew he wouldn't leave a message. In his mind, leaving a voicemail was a sign of weakness. It meant he was waiting on you. Sure enough, exactly 30 seconds later, the phone started vibrating again. He was demanding my immediate attention. I took a slow, deep breath, let the phone ring 3 times, and then swiped the screen to answer. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotion. "Where the hell have you been?" Victor barked immediately. There was no greeting, no asking how I was doing. Just the aggressive, entitled demand for my submission. "Your mother has been worried sick. You haven't responded to a single message in the group chat, you haven't answered your aunt, and you haven't confirmed your attendance for the rehearsal dinner on Friday." "I have been busy," I replied simply, tracing the edge of a financial prospectus with my finger. "Busy doing what?" Sulking, he sneered. The absolute arrogance in his voice was staggering. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed that by stealing my money, he had put me in my place, and now I was just throwing a quiet tantrum before inevitably falling back into line. "Listen to me, Stella. I am calling to give you one final chance to make this right. I am willing to forgive your disrespectful behavior from last month, but there are conditions." I almost laughed, but I kept my composure. "Conditions," I repeated neutrally. "That's right," Victor said, his tone turning into the stern, commanding voice of a patriarch handing down a decree. "You will show up to the venue on Saturday morning bright and early. You will help your sister with whatever she needs without a single complaint. You will smile for the photographs, and you will behave like a loving, supportive member of this family. Furthermore, it is customary to give a substantial gift to the bride and groom. I expect you to bring a check for no less than $1,000. You can use whatever is left of your part-time library money or put it on a credit card. I don't care, but you will show your sister that you respect her." The audacity was breathtaking. He had stolen $180,000 from me, forced me into a position where he assumed I would have to take out loans to finish my degree, and now he was demanding that I go into debt to buy Mackenzie a wedding present to prove my loyalty. "And if I don't?" I asked quietly. Victor's voice dropped an octave, turning cold and absolute. "If you do not walk through those doors on Saturday morning with a smile on your face and a gift in your hand, you are done. I will officially disown you. You will not be welcome in my house. You will receive no support, no inheritance, and no family. You will be entirely on your own in this world, with absolutely nothing. Is that clear?" He was playing his trump card. The threat of abandonment. For 22 years, that threat had been the invisible chain around my neck. It was the fear that kept me quiet, the fear that made me accept the hand-me-down coats while Mackenzie got sports cars. But sitting in my penthouse, looking out at the city I had conquered through my own sheer brilliance and hard work, the threat sounded utterly pathetic. He was threatening to take away something I had already realized had absolutely zero value. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him I knew he was bluffing, even though I knew he wasn't. I just gave him exactly what he wanted. "Understood, Victor," I said. There was a split second of silence on the line. I had called him Victor again. Not Dad. Victor. "Excuse me," he demanded, his voice rising in anger. I didn't repeat myself. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red end call button. I didn't block his number yet. I needed the line open for Saturday. I placed the phone back on the counter, picked up my pen, and went back to reviewing my investment portfolio. The ultimatum had been delivered, and the trap was perfectly set. Saturday morning arrived. The day of Mackenzie's ridiculously overpriced, artificially perfect wedding. The weather in the Seattle area was classic Pacific Northwest, a steady, gloomy drizzle with low-hanging gray clouds that threatened a heavy downpour later in the afternoon. It was the exact kind of weather that would send an entitled, perfectionist bride into an absolute, screaming spiral. Through a mutual friend from high school named Bethany, who had unfortunately been roped into being a secondary bridesmaid, I received a play-by-play of the morning's absolute chaos. My phone occasionally buzzed with brief, frantic text updates from her. Mackenzie had apparently thrown a glass of champagne at the wall because the makeup artist had used the wrong shade of peach on her cheekbones. Brenda was running around the bridal suite crying, popping anxiety medication, and screaming at the venue staff because the floral arches, the very arches my college fund had paid for, were slightly drooping from the humidity. Victor was pacing the hallways, red in the face, aggressively checking his watch and threatening to sue the catering company because the imported linens were the wrong shade of ivory. The entire family was trapped in a suffocating pressure cooker of their own making. Meanwhile, my morning was the exact, polar opposite. I woke up at 9 in the morning naturally, without an alarm clock. I stretched out in my massive, king-size bed, surrounded by high thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets. I walked into my pristine kitchen, barefoot on the heated hardwood floors, and brewed a cup of incredibly expensive, single-origin artisan coffee. The rain pattered gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, creating a peaceful, rhythmic soundtrack to my morning. I didn't put on a bridesmaid dress. I didn't curl my hair or paint my nails. I took a long, hot shower in my walk-in glass enclosure, put on a comfortable pair of tailored slacks and a cashmere sweater, and sat down at my dining table. Today wasn't a day of celebration for my sister, it was a day of monumental professional advancement for me. I had a scheduled video conference with two prominent venture capitalists from San Francisco. I had decided to take a small portion of my $3.5 million and become an angel investor, backing a promising new artificial intelligence startup founded by a group of brilliant female engineers. For 2 hours, while Mackenzie was likely hyperventilating over her veil, I was analyzing market projections, discussing equity splits, and negotiating board seats. By noon, I electronically signed the final paperwork, authorizing a $200,000 investment. I closed my laptop, took a sip of my coffee, and smiled. I had just effortlessly moved more money before lunch than Victor made in an entire year, and I had done it while wearing slippers. As the clock ticked closer to 2 in the afternoon, the scheduled start time for the wedding ceremony, the contrast between our two worlds felt almost cinematic. They were performing a desperate, incredibly expensive play to convince a room full of people that they were a perfect, wealthy, loving family. I was sitting in silence, utterly alone, wielding more real power and holding more actual wealth than the entire wedding party combined. I walked over to the window and looked out at the gray city below. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. There was no anxiety, no lingering guilt, no fear of the fallout. The little girl who used to hide in her bedroom to avoid her father's temper was entirely gone. I was ready to pull the pin on the grenade. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, 15 minutes after the ceremony was supposed to begin, my phone rang. The screen flashed Victor's name. I didn't answer it. I let it ring out, watching the screen glow in the quiet of my living room. 5 minutes later, it rang again. Then a third time. They were stalling the ceremony. Mackenzie was probably having a meltdown in the bridal suite, refusing to walk down the aisle because her designated punching bag hadn't shown up to kiss the ring. Finally, a voicemail notification popped up on my screen. I unlocked the phone, tapped the icon, and put it on speaker so Victor's voice could echo through my empty, $1 million apartment. Stella, Victor's voice practically spat through the speaker. He wasn't trying to maintain his authoritative, composed patriarch persona anymore. He sounded completely unhinged, his voice trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. I am standing in the hallway of the venue. The string quartet has been playing the same song for 20 minutes. Your sister is in tears. You are not here. I told you what the consequences would be, and you chose to test me. You absolute, ungrateful little sociopath. Consider this your formal notice. You are entirely disowned. Do not ever call me. Do not ever show up at our house. If you are struggling to pay your rent, if you can't afford your tuition, if you end up on the streets, do not look to us. You are dead to this family. You are a complete and utter failure. The voicemail clicked off. I didn't flinch. Hearing him explicitly state that I was dead to him didn't hurt. It felt like a heavy, iron lock finally snapping open. Immediately after the voicemail ended, the family group chat began to explode. The notification bell chimed rapidly, a relentless digital assault. I opened the chat. It was a bloodbath. My Aunt Pamela wrote, "Stella is a monster. I cannot believe she is ruining Mackenzie's day out of pure jealousy." Cousin Derek added, "She's always been a loser. Let her rot in her cheap apartment. Mackenzie doesn't need that toxic garbage around her." Dozens of messages poured in from aunts, uncles, and cousins I barely spoke to, all piling on, calling me selfish, bitter, and pathetic. They were hyping each other up, building a narrative where I was a jealous, impoverished failure trying to drag down the beautiful, successful golden child. I stood in the center of my living room, the phone in my hand, reading every single hateful word. They were so confident in their cruelty. They felt completely safe attacking me because Victor had convinced them all that I was weak, that I had nothing, and that I was entirely dependent on his non-existent generosity. They thought they were punching down. I took a deep breath, walked over to my kitchen island, and sat down on a leather bar stool. The time for observing was over. It was time for the drop. I opened my secure files and began to methodically assemble the response. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to write a long, emotional paragraph explaining my feelings or begging them to understand my side. Narcissists don't care about feelings, they only care about power, status, and public image. If I wanted to destroy them, I had to attack the only thing they valued. I had to expose the absolute truth, backed by undeniable, mathematical facts. I cracked my knuckles, tapped the text box in the family group chat, and prepared to detonate the bomb. The family group chat was still rapidly scrolling with insults when I began to attach the files. I moved with the precision of a surgeon. First, I selected a high-resolution screenshot I had taken weeks ago from the online banking portal. It clearly showed the joint account history. It highlighted the exact date, the exact time, and the exact amount, a $180,000 outbound transfer. Right next to it, I highlighted the destination, Victor's personal checking account. Underneath the image, I typed a single, simple sentence. I hope the floral arrangements were worth it. Enjoy the wedding, funded entirely by my stolen college savings. I hit send. Second, I attached a screenshot of my personal, private trust account statement. It showed my name clearly at the top. Below it, in bold black numbers, was the current available balance, $3.5 million. Alongside the bank statement, I attached a screenshot of a small article snippet from Forbes magazine's online tech section that had run a few weeks prior, mentioning my name and the successful multi-million-dollar acquisition of my cybersecurity software. Underneath these images, I typed, "You told me to take out a student loan, Victor. I think I'll pass. I sold my software company 3 months ago." I hit send. Finally, I attached a photograph I had taken that very morning. It was a selfie, but not a vain one. It showed me standing in the massive, sunlit living room of my penthouse, holding up the heavy metal keys. Behind me, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the entire Seattle skyline and the Puget Sound spread out like a painting. It was a picture of undeniable, overwhelming wealth and absolute independence. Underneath the photo, I typed my final message to the people who shared my DNA. You threatened to leave me with nothing, Victor. You threatened to disown a daughter who is already a millionaire. Keep the $180,000 as a parting gift. Consider it charity to keep your favorite daughter from facing reality. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. Every single one of you is permanently blocked. I hit send. I didn't wait to see the little red receipts pop up. I didn't wait to see if anyone was typing. The instant the third message went through, I went into the group chat settings and permanently left the conversation. Then I went into my phone's master settings. I blocked Victor. I blocked Brenda. I blocked Mackenzie. I blocked Aunt Pamela, Cousin Derek, and every single relative who had ever sneered at me or sent a hateful message in that chat. Then, just to be absolutely certain, I logged into my cellular provider's portal and requested a complete phone number change. Within 10 minutes, the number I had used since high school was deactivated and completely dead. I set the phone down on the quartz counter. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just peaceful, it was triumphant. I walked back over to the windows, looking down at the city streets far below. Somewhere in Bellevue, in an overpriced venue, my father was staring at his phone, realizing that the daughter he thought he had crushed under his heel had actually just bought the entire building he was standing in, metaphorically speaking. The illusion of his power, the illusion of his wealth, and the illusion of his perfect family had just been atomized in front of every single relative he cared about impressing. I didn't need to be there to see the look on his face. Knowing the truth was out there, undeniable and permanent, was the most satisfying victory I could have ever asked for. I didn't witness the immediate fallout of the group chat drop in person, but in the digital age, secrets do not exist, especially when you detonate them in front of an entire extended family. A few weeks later, I met up with Bethany, the mutual friend who had been a bridesmaid, for coffee at a high-end cafe near my building. I paid for our drinks, sat back, and let her recount the greatest disaster in our family's history. According to Bethany, the timing of my messages was absolutely catastrophic. Victor had just finished his furious voicemail to me and walked back into the bridal suite to tell Mackenzie that they were proceeding without me. At that exact moment, the phones of 20 different relatives sitting in the chapel pews all buzzed simultaneously. People opened the chat to continue the hate train, but instead, they saw the bank statement. They saw the Forbes article. They saw the penthouse. Bethany said the reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. The murmurs started in the back pews and spread like wildfire. Aunt Pamela, who had just called me a jealous monster, apparently let out a loud gasp and practically dropped her phone. Cousin Derek turned completely white. People started furiously zooming in on the screenshots, verifying the numbers, reading the article snippet. Within 3 minutes, nobody in that chapel gave a single thought to Mackenzie or her wedding dress. The entire congregation was buzzing with the shocking revelation that Victor was a thief and that the quiet, ignored younger sister was secretly a tech millionaire. Word reached the bridal suite before the music even started. An uncle marched up to Victor, shoved his phone in Victor's face, and demanded to know if it was true that he had stolen his mother's inheritance money. Bethany said Victor physically staggered backward. All the color drained from his face. He tried to stammer out a defense, tried to say it was a misunderstanding, but the evidence was right there in black and white. Mackenzie's perfect day was completely derailed. When she finally walked down the aisle, the room wasn't looking at her with awe, they were whispering behind their hands. The reception was even worse. Instead of celebrating the newlyweds, relatives huddled in corners, aggressively gossiping. The family dynamics shifted instantly. The relatives who had spent years kissing up to Victor because he projected wealth suddenly realized he was secretly robbing his own child to keep up appearances. Worse, they realized they had spent the morning violently insulting the only actual millionaire in the family. Bethany told me that Aunt Pamela actually cornered Brenda near the buffet, aggressively demanding to know if they could get my new contact information so she could apologize for the misunderstanding. The sheer, naked greed of these people was predictable and pathetic. Mackenzie spent half the reception crying in the bathroom, furious that I had stolen her spotlight without even being in the same zip code. The fairy tale shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces of reality. 6 months passed. The Seattle winter rolled in, bringing dark skies and freezing rain. I settled into my new life beautifully. I hired a personal trainer, started consulting for a few tech startups, and enjoyed the quiet luxury of my penthouse. I hadn't spoken a single word to my family since the day of the wedding. I assumed they had taken the hint and retreated in shame. I was wrong. Narcissists don't feel shame. They only feel desperation when they lose control of a resource. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. I was coming back from a consulting meeting, walking through the marble lobby of my secure residential building. I nodded to the concierge and headed toward the private elevators. "Excuse me, Stella?" I stopped. The voice was familiar, but it lacked the booming authority it used to carry. I turned around. Standing near the glass entry doors, looking incredibly out of place and deeply uncomfortable, were Victor and Brenda. I stared at them. They looked older. Victor had lost weight, and his posture was slightly hunched, lacking that arrogant puff of the chest he always relied on. Brenda looked tired, her usually perfect hair slightly frizzy from the rain. They had clearly gone to immense lengths to track down my physical address, probably hiring a private investigator, since my property was held in a blind trust. I didn't walk towards them. I stood my ground near the security desk. "How did you get in here?" I asked, my voice completely flat. "We waited for someone to open the door," Victor said, taking a hesitant step forward. He forced a smile that looked painful. "Stella, please. We just want to talk. Just for 5 minutes." "We don't have anything to talk about," I said. I looked at the security guard, who was already standing up, recognizing my discomfort. "Please, sweetie," Brenda chimed in, her eyes welling up with highly practiced tears. "We miss you. The family is completely torn apart. We know we made mistakes. We know Victor shouldn't have moved that money without asking. But you have to understand the pressure we were under. We always knew you were destined for greatness. We are so incredibly proud of you." The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically choke on it. 6 months ago, I was a toxic sociopath and a failure. Now that they knew my net worth, they were incredibly proud. "Why are you actually here, Victor?" I asked, cutting through her tears. "Let's skip the fake apologies. You didn't hire a PI to find me because you miss me. What do you want?" Victor swallowed hard. His eyes darted around the luxurious lobby, taking in the wealth he couldn't access. "It's Mackenzie," he muttered, looking at the floor. "Her husband, well, he lost his job. And they bought a house they couldn't afford. They are facing foreclosure, Stella. They are drowning in debt. We tried to help, but the wedding tapped out our savings. She's your sister. She's desperate. Alone, just a small bridge loan to save her house, would mean nothing to you, but it would save her life." There it was. The absolute, staggering audacity. They had stolen my future to pay for her party, and now they wanted me to bail her out of the consequences of her own financial stupidity. I looked at my parents standing in the lobby of my building. I searched my heart, genuinely looking for a spark of anger, a flicker of sadness, or even a desire to yell at them. But there was absolutely nothing. The well was completely dry. I didn't hate them. I just didn't care about them anymore. They were strangers asking for a handout. "No," I said simply. The word hung in the air, sharp and absolute. Brenda gasped. "Stella, how can you be so cold? She is your flesh and blood. She is going to lose her home. She is a 26-year-old adult who blew through $180,000 in college, had a wedding funded by my stolen money, and bought a house she couldn't afford," I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. "That is not my problem. And you two are the ones who enabled her entire life. You built this disaster. Now you get to live in it. You have millions of dollars." Victor suddenly yelled, his old temper flaring up, his face turning red. "You're sitting up there in a penthouse while your family goes bankrupt. You owe us." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I said, stepping closer to him, my eyes locking onto his. "You stole from me. You threatened me. You told me I was dead to you. I simply agreed with you. You made your choice, Victor. You chose your golden child. Now she is entirely your responsibility." I turned away from them and looked directly at the security guard. "Marcus," I said clearly, "these two individuals are not my guests. They are trespassing. Please escort them off the property immediately. If they ever return, call the police and have them arrested." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, immediately stepping out from behind the desk, placing his hand firmly on Victor's arm. "All right, folks, it's time to leave." "Stella, you can't do this." Brenda wailed as Marcus guided them toward the sliding glass doors. Victor was shouting something about me being ungrateful, but his voice was muffled as the heavy doors closed behind them, locking them out in the cold Seattle rain. I watched them stand on the sidewalk for a moment, looking confused and defeated, before they finally turned and walked away. I walked to the private elevator, swiped my key fob, and rode up to the 32nd floor. When I walked into my penthouse, the silence welcomed me. It was a beautiful, warm, golden silence. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about money or revenge, or even proving the people who doubted me wrong. It was about self-worth. For 22 years, I measured my value by how much approval I received from a family that was fundamentally incapable of loving me. I thought that if I was just quiet enough, or smart enough, or agreeable enough, they would finally see me. What I didn't realize was that true power doesn't come from forcing toxic people to respect you. True power comes from realizing that their respect is completely worthless. I didn't win because I became a millionaire. I won because I stopped needing them. I let my sister face the consequences of her own actions. I let my parents wallow in the financial ruin they created. I cut the dead weight from my life, and I finally learned how to fly. Am I wrong for letting my sister face bankruptcy and refusing to help my parents, even after they begged for forgiveness? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and let me know your verdict in the comments below. Have you ever dealt with a golden child dynamic in your family? Share your experiences. I read every single comment.